Well, good morning and welcome to all of our participants who are joining our webinar today. This is the first keynote lecture for the EcoExchangeEdu 2021 Sustainability Showcase. And our first speaker today is Dr. George Veni, who is speaking on the International Year of Caves and Karst, Hidden Landscapes, Waters, and Ecosystems. Dr. George Veni is the Executive Director of the United States National Cave and Karst Research Institute and an internationally recognized hydrogeologist specializing in caves and karst terrains. He serves as President of the International Union of Speleology and as such, the organizer of the International Year of Caves and Karst. He has published and presented nearly 270 papers on hydrogeology, biology, and environmental management in karst terrains. Karst is a landscape that covers about 20% of the world's land surface, but relatively few have heard of it and its many benefits and challenges to humanity, which is why the International Year of Caves and Karst was organized. Karst landscapes take different forms on the surface, but also extend underground as landscapes hidden from general view, where they contain diverse, complex, and highly vulnerable aquifers and ecosystems. Please join me today in welcoming Dr. Veni as he educates us on caves and karst landscapes.
Well, thank you very much. Let me switch over and grab the screen here. There we go. Come on, there we go. And set up my pointer. All right. So thank you very much for welcoming me and also for having me, kick off this series of lectures for you. One of the big themes that you're focusing on, of course, is ecosystem restoration, and the first step in restoration of an ecosystem is understanding that area. And when it comes to karst, well, caves and karst are not well understood. That's why, as Dr. Mitchell just said, we've got the International Year of Caves and Karst to talk about their hidden landscapes, their hidden waters, and their hidden ecosystems. So with this presentation, I won't focus so much on the restoration part. That's going to be a very short part at the end. There'll be some interspersed information, but mostly I'm going to focus on what they are, how they function, and some of the challenges and threats that we encounter in working with these caves and karst systems. So let's just jump right into it and start answering the most basic question. What is karst? Karst is a type of landscape. It's a type of terrain formed primarily by dissolution of the bedrock. And so typically we're looking at limestone, dolomite, marble, carbonate rocks. And if you're in arid climates, you're looking at things like gypsum and halite, rock salt. Typical features that we find in karst are caves, sinkholes, underground streams, and the world's largest springs and wells occur in karst areas. So this is a karst area in China, in Guangxi province. And so when you look at the mountains in the background, you'd think, okay, these mountains were shoved up. Well, not quite. What happened was the landscape as a whole was shoved up, but the valleys in between were actually dissolved down, not worn down by streams, but dissolved down chemically by the water to create these valleys in between that drain on off into this underground stream system, much of which has collapsed. This natural bridge is left behind, and it flows underneath into a cave entrance that's about, it's about 150 meters tall. It's a huge cave entrance. So, but that's karst. It's a landscape, much like mountains and beaches are certain types of landscapes. But again, most people have never heard of the word, unfortunately. We're working to change that. So where is karst? This is the latest, greatest world karst map. The blue areas show karst around the world. In the United States, about 25% of the country is karst or a related terrain known as pseudokarst. But generally speaking, karst covers about 20% of the land surface of the planet. And that, in a sense, is an underestimate. because this is only the exposed karst at the surface. You have many areas around the world where karst is buried by other rocks, but it's accessible for water. You can drill down into it. For example, the south side of San Antonio, you can drill down into the Hydrological Aquifer to extract water, or in some places less favorable, where the land surface above, while not karstic, collapses down into the karst. Now, underground geologic mapping is pretty limited, but the limited information I've seen makes me suspect that perhaps about 40% of the world's land surface is in karst or affected by underlying karst in those regions. So I should introduce my institute, the National Cave and Karst Research Institute. We were created by an act of Congress to conduct, support, facilitate, promote cave research, management, public education, archiving of data, and collaborations to support all of these above. So that's in a nutshell who we are. We're located in the city of Carlsbad, New Mexico, because we were created in partnership with the state of New Mexico and the city of Carlsbad. And of course, if you want more information, here's our website. So next term, what's an aquifer? In San Antonio, and I should say that though I live in New Mexico, I consider San Antonio home. The Edwards Aquifer is a hot topic of discussion. It has been for many years in San Antonio. But what is an aquifer? Technically speaking, it's an underground reservoir of water, but it needs to be economically accessible for use. If it's not economically accessible, it's really not considered an aquifer. You're not going to spend thousands of dollars drilling down to get a teaspoon of water. So it needs to be a large enough reservoir. Now, when people see this term reservoir, they automatically tend to think of underground lakes and rivers, but most aquifers don't function that way. There are three major types of aquifers, and each of these squares here is at a different scale. The first is a porous media type of aquifer, and this is at a microscopic scale. And what you're looking at here are grains of sand and silt. And the water in the porous media aquifer, oops, pressed the button the wrong way. There we go. The water in the porous media aquifer tends to flow around these grains and sometimes through them. And this is a great media to filter the water from contaminants. And the water ends up moving in a very uniform, predictable fashion as a result. Moves quite slowly as well. Your second type of aquifer system, and I should point out locally, if you think of south of San Antonio, the Carrizo Wilcox aquifer is a porous media type system. Now, a fracture aquifer is one where you have dense, essentially impermeable rock, and the water is trapped within these fractures. The scale here is probably life size in terms of what you're seeing on your screen. These fractures may be a millimeter or less, or a little bit larger in size, and the water moves through these fractures, usually again in a general direction, but again following more complicated flow paths and limited to the fractures themselves. It moves a bit quicker than you see in a porous media system, and examples of these in the San Antonio area would be the granite aquifer up around Enchanted Rock. And third, we have our karst aquifers. The scale here can be anywhere from microscopic to these holes being large enough for a train or even an airplane to fly through. And so we're talking about a very different, very complicated system. Water flows in a variety of complicated paths. These are the most complicated types of aquifers in the system. Locally, you think, well, wait a minute, which way is the water going? It's going this way, that way, that way. Overall, it will have a general trend, but getting down to that spring where it ultimately discharges, you'll see a lot of convolutions within the aquifer itself. And so this is the type of aquifer that we're dealing with. Karst, again, the most complicated type of groundwater system on the planet. So how do karst aquifers form? They start with fractures. Fractures capture water, and water is naturally acidic. It picks up carbon dioxide from the sky in rainfall. It picks up carbon dioxide from the soil that's being respired by plants. And so it forms a weak carbonic acid. And as water moves down through fractures in the bedrock, it begins to dissolve out those fractures and eventually form a conduit. Now, once a conduit is formed, a hole this size is far more efficient at transmitting water. So as a result, it captures water from the surrounding fractures. And because it captures more water, it then enlarges faster. Because it becomes bigger, it can capture even more water from more fractures. The process self-accelerates until that conduit becomes large enough for a person to enter, and we call that conduit a cave. And so a conduit, or I should say a cave, is a humanly accessible conduit. Now, what defines a conduit? A conduit is something that's about 10 millimeters in diameter or width or larger, 10 millimeters. That's a little bit smaller than your pinky finger. Now think about that, because a hole that's the size of your pinky finger hydrologically functions the same way as this cave does in terms of its ability to transport sediment, contaminants, turbulent flow conditions, difficult to model conditions, and also to serve as habitat for groundwater fauna. So conduits are just simply humanly inaccessible caves, or caves are humanly accessible conduits. So when we talk about karst hydrology, I'll often talk about caves and conduits because they're really, hydrologically speaking, identical. How do karst aquifers work? I'm sure everyone's familiar with the basic hydrological cycle. The same applies here. Rainfall comes down from the sky, and then it goes into the ground in different ways. Some of it will go into the tightest of fractures, into the very matrix of the rock itself, and fill and go through these areas and move very slowly. Some will move down fractures. Some of those fractures may reach a cave down below and result in drip water in caves to create stalactites, stalagmites, which generically are called speleothems. When some of the fractures enlarge large enough, they may form these bowl-shaped depressions we call sinkholes. Some water may actually run off some impermeable non-karstic rocks directly into a cave entrance into the karst. Some might enter other sinkholes that form by collapse into an underlying passage. When the water enters the karst, it enters what's known as the vadose zone. This is the zone above the water table, and the water table is shown by this dotted dark blue line. And so in the vadose zone, water flows primarily vertically, trying to get down to that water table. Once it reaches the water table, it loses a lot of energy, and the water flows primarily horizontally off to a valley, to where it discharges. It may also discharge the valley, maybe to a river, it may be to a lake, or it may ultimately, the ultimate base level is down at the oceans. In some cases, if the limestone continues deeper, then the water will continue on deeper and go below a confining unit and rise up along fractures as an artesian spring. This is somewhat of the situation that we have with the Edwards Aquifer. Much of the water is confined under impermeable rocks and rises from fractures at a number of springs, primarily in San Antonio, New Braunfels, and San Marcos. Now, the zone below the water table is what we call the phreatic zone. The phreatic zone is the zone where all cracks, crevices, pore spaces, caves, all voids are completely filled with water. So above the water table, you might have some air, you might have some water-filled zones, but overall you still have airspace within, above and below them. Below the water table is all water-filled. Now, a karst aquifer evolves with time. So as you look at this passage here that's high and dry, at one point, this was a hydrologically active passage, and this would have formed a spring. But then the valley that it drained to got deeper, water was abandoned and formed a new spring. And as the valley continues to incise, eventually this passage here will be abandoned, and this one will become the new gravity spring for the aquifer. Now, just because a passage is hydrologically abandoned doesn't always mean that it's permanently abandoned. Sometimes yes, but sometimes no. If the aquifer floods high enough, the water level can rise up, reactivate this passage, and water can flow down it. Now, in this diagram, it shows that it goes to the same valley, but in many cases, it may go in a completely different location. So if you think that that you're safe from, let's say, a spill, some contamination episode that might happen during normal flow conditions in the aquifer, during high flow conditions, you may not be safe. That water may come over to where you are located. So you're getting a sense of the complexity of karst. And when people ask me, how old is karst groundwater? Is it thousands of years old, hundreds of years old, months old, days old, hours old? The answer is yes. It's all of the above. It just depends what part of the system you're monitoring. And likewise, the chemistry of the system, the water chemistry, will vary according to what part of the system you're monitoring. So let's start looking at these hidden landscapes. And not all of them are quite hidden. Some are dramatic. And so the most dramatic landscapes occur where the rock is thickly bedded to massive, meaning it's unbedded. Areas where there's moderate to high rainfall. And what's really key is rapid regional uplift. So here we see two examples from China. Tower karst in China, and then a highly pinnacled karst in the stone forest in Yunnan province. Fabulous areas if you ever can get there to go look at it. It's just spectacularly, visually spectacular areas. Why do we have this forming? Yes, you've got other areas of the world where you have massive and thick bedrocks. Yes, you have other areas of the world that have moderate and high rainfall, but they don't form this sort of terrain. What's key is regional rapid uplift. In this case, what happened, the Indian subcontinent rammed into Asia and caused massive uplift throughout Southeast Asia. So as a result, as water dissolved its way downward, the landscape was rising upward fast enough that the water, instead of dissolving laterally, focused on dissolving downward in this case, and then due to different circumstances, forming these steep karst pinnacles. In this case, they're about 20 meters tall. These are over 100 meters tall. Very dramatic landscapes. Other types of dramatic karst are what we call cockpit karst and cone karst. The example here is from Puerto Rico. And if you look at these hills, you can see some areas between these hills, and these areas are actually giant sinkholes known as cockpits. The Arecibo radio telescope, which until a few years ago was the largest in the world, and unfortunately has collapsed within the past year, and there's some debate whether it'll be rebuilt again. But this fills a sinkhole, a cockpit, that's about 300 meters in diameter. And so if you were able to step away and get back high enough, you'd see that similar sized sinkholes or cockpits occur between all these pokey up, hills in the background. Essentially, think of it as a terrain of egg cartons, just going off forever into the distance. And so again, we have massive and thickly bedded rock, moderate to high rainfall, but your uplift isn't as great, isn't as fast in these areas. Now, if this process continues, what will happen is the sinkholes will broaden and then interconnect into a landscape like here in the island of Bohol in the Philippines, the Chocolate Hills, where you have what's called cone karst. The cockpits are gone. The sinkholes, the depressions between the hills are gone, and all you're left are the cones, the karsted cones in between. Again, beautiful, spectacular areas. Now, let's move into what's called more classical karst. Strictly speaking, the classical karst is in modern day Slovenia and a little bit of Italy. And so this is the classical karst. It's a region known as the Kras. The Germans Germanicized the word Kras to make it karst. And so as you look at this photo, you see a field, and it says here that this is Černiško polje. Well, polje is a Slovene word for field, but it's a specialized word because in the karst, the fields only occur in giant sinkholes. And so what you're looking at is one corner of a giant sinkhole, and it's a flat floored sinkhole, and you have limestone hills in the background. You have smaller sinkholes in between them, but this is all karst. It's more of a subdued type of terrain. In this area, the rock is medium to thickly bedded, moderate rainfall, and uplift is much lower. Now, in the US, while it's not the classical karst, it is classic karst for the US. If we look at central Kentucky, where Mammoth Cave, the world's longest cave, occurs, it's even more topographically subdued. The rolling in and out is going in and out of sinkholes. Here's one, another one, another one, another one, another one hidden in the trees here. So what we're starting to see is that even though we're talking about landscapes, the karst is hidden in plain sight because most people walk through, drive through these landscapes and don't really realize what they are. Don't realize that they're karst. Don't notice that there are no surface streams or very few surface streams in this area, which is one of the classic features of karst, the lack of surface water, except of course when it rains, or a few major base flow streams. So these landscapes are hidden in plain sight. So we also have a more subdued karst, where again, the karst is hidden in plain sight. The photo here on the right is from northern Bexar County. And what you're looking at here that I'm circling is a sinkhole. It's just a very tiny one. Sinkholes like these are common in central Texas and many other parts of the world. Most people wouldn't think twice, wouldn't even consider this a sinkhole. I've dug open sinkholes smaller than this one and found hydrologically important caves, biologically, archaeologically important, paleontologically important caves. But again, most people look at these and they don't even notice them. They wouldn't even consider them sinkholes in some areas. Now, if you come out to where I currently live, this is a photo from Carlsbad Caverns National Park. Again, you look at this landscape, you think just some desert hillsides, a desert valley. You would not think karst unless you looked very closely at the rock and you would see some dissolutional features in the rock itself, or unless you stumbled across a cave entrance. And most of the cave entrances in arid karst occur where the landscape has literally just cut across and intersected a cave that pre-existed underground. And so this is the entrance to Carlsbad Cavern. And so let's now take a dive deeper into the truly hidden underground landscapes that exist. So as we go underground, I mentioned it before, the Vados zone. We have different morphologies that can be very instructive to tell us about how these systems work. So in the Vados zone, again, we're looking at vertical flow primarily. So in this cave, Gufre Ba'ala from Lebanon, it's intersected a stream from a surface and the water plunges 63 meters down to the water table. Here are a couple of people for scale to give you a sense of the size of this feature. So it plunges 63 meters down to the water table. Now think about that, because when you're trying to protect water, one of the tools that's often used in the United States, at least, is a method that the EPA recommends called DRASTIC. And DRASTIC is an acronym. D stands for depth. meaning the deeper it is from the surface to the water table, the more protection you have. But here, what sort of protection do you have from contaminants when the water can free fall 63 meters down to the water table? Depth is irrelevant when it comes to karst. One of the reasons karst is difficult to protect and difficult to model. Now, not everything is a free fall down to the water table. So here we've got an example from Italy, Grotti di Falbatera, which is has an underground stream, a passage that's up here, goes down the waterfall, and then comes down this rock face here, and then into the pool here, a little bit of a spill over here. So the water is stair-stepping down a steep gradient. Again, a very steep gradient, trying to get down to the water table as quickly as possible. Now, within the vadose zone, but also in the phreatic zone, it's just I can show you better photos more easily in the vadose zone, we have deposits that occur. Now, most people, when they think of cave deposits, they think of the pretty stuff. They think of the speleothems. There are over 250 different minerals that are known to occur in caves. Calcite is by far the most common. And this is from a local cave, Cave with a name, just north of Burney. And so we've got the typical features: stalactites, stalagmites, columns, flowstone, pool deposits, rimstone pools, and so forth. But what does this sit on? This sits on sediments. And so if we look below at the sediments, we see some very interesting features oftentimes. And this is a great example from Caverna de Santo Tomas in Cuba. Sadly, many people treat cave sediments like dirt. And pardon the pun, but I'm being quite serious. But look at this. We've got this silt deposit featured by this coarse gravel cobble deposit, followed by silt, followed by clay, and then followed by calcite crystalline deposits. We're looking at a series of events that are desperately trying to tell us something here. And so whether you're talking about sediments or crystalline deposits, you've got tremendous information about the history of the area. Locked in the crystals, you can understand temperature, humidity conditions on the surface. In both sediments and in crystals, we can look at pollens and spores. We can look at bones. The sediment deposits will certainly tell us a lot about hydrologic conditions within the aquifer as well as on the surface. So tremendous paleoenvironmental, paleoclimatic information that we can gather from caves. In fact, paleoclimate scientists are recognizing that the most important sites to understand the planet's paleoclimate are found in caves. There's great work being done in coring the ice up in Greenland and down in Antarctica, great work being done getting deep sea core data, but they're telling you specifically what's happening at the poles in the middle and in the middle of the ocean. Whereas in caves, it's telling you what happened in our backyard. And if we model enough of these places, we can develop some truly amazing paleoclimate models for the planet. Now let's look at the phreatic zone. I don't have any photos to show you of water-filled caves, but I don't need any because, again, the morphologies tell us so much. This is a photo of the Snowball Dining Room, a part of the Mammoth Cave system. And just by looking at the shape, I can see that this cave, this passage at least, formed in the phreatic zone. The walls are smooth and regular. It's a nice oval formed along a bedding plane here that cuts across the passage. And so if we understand the morphologies, again, we can understand so much about these hidden systems. So this is a chart I developed and published in the paper some years ago. And what we're looking at the Snowball Dining Room is this situation here, where our fracture or bedding plane is horizontal and it reflects the phreatic condition. If we see this sort of morphology, we've got phreatic conditions, but a vertical fracture of bedding, diagonal here. If we're in the vadose zone, the walls are more irregularly shaped, and whether they're wide or narrow or really more convoluted here will depend on the on the orientation of the fractures or bedding. We also have incised passages, and so in this case, the phreatic passage was up here, and was up here. but then the water table lowered and cut into the floor to create this irregular vadose trench. Now, we don't always see that. We don't see it here in the snowball dining room. In this case, the water table dropped pretty rapidly. That didn't allow time for really any significant incision of the floor to occur. So these shapes are not random, and they're telling us something about the aquifer. And if we really want to understand the underground landscape, we need to understand these cave maps. I started as a caver many years ago, and I was doing the Captain Kirk thing. I was going where no one had gone before, and I started mapping these things to document my discovery. But now, as a karst hydrogeologist, when I look at cave maps, I'm seeing the permeability structure of these aquifers. So if I look at this example here, I don't need anyone to tell me, the geology of this area. Certainly I do in detail, but in principle, I can look at this and say, well, wait a minute, this is an area, this is an aquifer that's fed by many sinkholes converging together, and the angularity of these passages tell me that they're forming along fractures. A similar situation here, but more a curved pattern, tell me that we've got bedding planes controlling it more than fractures. If we have, for example, I don't have time to go through all the examples. If I look at a maze pattern, that will tell me that it's either diffusing through an upper unit, like a sandstone, or it's a hypogenic type of maze, a very different system formed by water rising up through the ground instead of descending down through a sandstone. So again, looking at these cave maps, looking at this information is giving us a look into these underground landscapes and telling us a huge amount about how these aquifer work, and telling us how things work in parts of the aquifer that we physically can't squeeze into. So let's start looking at karst waters, and we'll go from surface waters to hidden waters to springs. But even the surface waters are really hidden. They're hidden in plain sight, as are karst landscapes. And part of the reason is because, again, surface water doesn't exist very long in karst. This is an example near UTSA. This cave is now gated. It wasn't gated when I took this photo. But normally this creek bed doesn't have any water in it. People don't think about surface water, and yet the stream flows on down following a rain and plunges 18 meters down toward the aquifer. If my friend here took one step forward, he would plummet, right down in there. He would not be filtered out of this groundwater system. This is what we call a sinking stream. And it's a specialized type of sinking stream that only occurs in karst, known as a swallow hole or a swallet, meaning that the stream swallows all of the water from a stream in a specific location. Now, some people will use the term losing stream, and when they mean sinking stream. The terms have been used interchangeably, but losing stream refers to a stream that loses its water over a broad distance. So this is the Diamond Y stream, an aerial view from Google Earth. Diamond Y is located north of Fort Stockton, Texas. Just follow Interstate 10 west a couple hundred miles and you'll find it. And here's Diamond Y. Water rises, and then as you go downstream several hundred meters, it eventually dries up, and about 600 meters or so downstream, it pretty much goes dry. So it loses its water over a distance. We find this in many cienagas, which is a Spanish term for desert spring environments. So we see this in many cienega type environments, but we also see it in many karst aquifers as well, where the water is being lost, and this is a karst aquifer here. The water is being lost in this case down through the alluvium into fractures, and in other places we'll see it lost directly into fractures. So here is another way that water is lost, through sinkholes. Water flows overland and goes down into sinkholes. Now, there are different types of sinkholes. We don't have time to get into all of them, but this is a solutionally formed sinkhole, meaning it started as a crack, dissolved and got larger and larger and larger into a funnel-shaped depression. This is not a sinkhole formed by collapse. This is a type of sinkhole formed to recharge its karst aquifer. These are the most common types of sinkholes. It's just that the collapse sinkholes that swallow homes and buildings and roads and people at times, unfortunately, tend to get all the press. But these are the good sinkholes. These are the ones that replenish our aquifers. And so a lot of water goes into karst aquifers this way. But also a lot of water goes into fractures. And so if you look at the fractured bedrock surface in a karst area, this is along a river, of course, a lot of water tends to get lost and sinks downward in that regard. But if you go into many upland areas, get out of the stream. So many times I've walked during a rainstorm or just after a rainstorm along the surface and watch water flowing down the surface, and then suddenly it stops. It goes into a fracture and it goes underground, and we don't see it on the other side of that fracture. So water rapidly is moving down into these karst aquifers. And we see this in other ways as well. So TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, what they require, and I'm not going to pick on them, they're typical of many other organizations in this regard. When they evaluate the vulnerability of a karst aquifer, they look at what they see on the surface. They see that there's a cave entrance here, and there's a little sinkhole next to it. And they figure, okay, it drains a little bit of water, here on the surface. Let's protect this area. Reasonable enough, at first glance. But what they don't recognize is the underground system that exists. That this is in fact the deepest cave in Bexar County. And when it rains, within 10 to 20, 30 minutes of a rainfall, water drips, dribbles, and pours in from all sorts of cracks and crevices. These are the conduits that I mentioned earlier. And if the water was moving slowly through like a porous media, we wouldn't see it in 10 or 20 minutes or 30 minutes. But the fact that it's moving through conduits tells us that it's moving quickly. And if we go and sample the water inside the cave, we're going to find geochemically, it's pretty much the same as what you see on the surface. And so all this water rapidly recharges, moves quickly through the aquifer, and convergent flow here, converges together and goes down to the water table at a depth of 78 meters. So effectively, we have no filtration, and conduit size is not a factor in preventing contamination. We don't see it as a factor, certainly in the humanly accessible conduits, and we don't see it as a factor in the water coming down through these fractures. Now, let's look at this in a little bit more detail. In May of 2000, the community of Walkerton in Ontario had a groundwater contamination episode. E. coli got into well number 7. And everyone understood in principle what happened. A farmer spread manure on the fields. There was a big storm. The storm flushed the manure down to the groundwater system. And unfortunately, the chlorinator for the well failed and the bacteria appeared there. So the community called a team of excellent hydrogeologists out to evaluate the aquifer. They felt that it was not a karst aquifer because there were no caves and sinkholes in the area. And so they used mod flow, which works great in porous media aquifers. They knew it was a limestone, but again, they didn't think it was karst. So they used mod flow to estimate travel time to well 7. And so from this dotted red line, they estimated it would take 720 hours for water to reach from here to the well. Why 720 hours? Well, 72 hours, 3 days, is within 72 hours, most bacteria, 95% of bacteria dies off once it's in the groundwater. And so this is 10 times longer. This is 30 days. This is a month of travel. And so bacteria should not have survived in any significance to reach well 7. How in the world did it get there? How did it survive? They were mystified. So some friends of mine who are excellent karst hydrogeologists up in Canada, they went out there and they put some dye in well number 9, and it reached well 7 in only 5 hours. Then they went here to well 6, and they injected some dye here. Now, based on this model and distance, it should have taken about 2 months, 2 months for the dye to reach well 7 if it went there at all. It got there in only 26 hours. When they put downhole cameras into these wells, what they found were finger-sized voids, finger-sized conduits transmitting water, showing how vulnerable the system is. Now, I've had many people tell me over the years, George, calm down. We get it. You're a cave guy. You like caves. You think they're important. We get it. Calm down. And I tell them, no, sir, I'm not going to calm down. Because in this case, 7 people died. 2,300 people became ill. Many of these people needed new kidneys and livers. This was preventable. No one, strictly speaking, did anything wrong. The problem was that no one understood that this was a karst aquifer. They didn't understand what that meant in terms of how vulnerable this system is to contamination. They didn't understand that you have to go the extra distance to really protect yourselves if you're working in this system, to have a backup chlorinator, an alarm system, a UV filter system, something as a backup to protect this in case that chlorinator failed. They didn't understand it, and they didn't understand that this was karst because they thought that karst was simply defined by caves and sinkholes. Part of the goal of the International Year of Caves and Karst is to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. So once water gets into the ground, it flows horizontally. This is along the water table. You're looking at an aquifer here, at a karst aquifer in Brazil in this location. And then in some places it may go deep, deeper still, completely filling the passage. And as a result, worldwide, about 700 million people depend on karst aquifers as their primary or sole source of water. 700 million people, about 10% of the world's population, depends on karst aquifers, and this includes the San Antonio region, the Edwards Hill country, the Edwards Plateau region. So we start thinking about how much water is there. I'm going to go back a few years. When I was an undergraduate at UTSA, and I asked my hydrogeology professor about karst groundwater, and he says, George, yeah, I get it. You like caves, but not that much water occurs in caves. And so here's a less dramatic photo, a more typical photo of a cave stream. Unlike the other one in Brazil, quite dramatic. This is more typical. This is up at Fort Hood. And he says there's really not that much water that occurs in caves. And he didn't think about conduits at the time, but later on, a team of excellent karst hydrogeologists did a study of 3 very different types of aquifers, basically the 2 end members in terms of types of aquifers, and one kind of middle of the road type aquifer in terms of hydrologically how they function. And they were studying how much water is in the conduits and caves and how much is in the matrix, the bedrock, and the fractures. And what they found was that at any given point in time, conduits store about 6% of the water within a karst aquifer. The results were pretty uniform across these very diverse type of karst aquifers. Only 6% of the water is stored there. And so my professor years ago was right. Not much water is in the conduits at any given point in time. That's the operative phrase. Because if you look at how much water moves through a karst aquifer over time, 99% of the water is moving through the conduits. The conduits is where the action is happening. The water that's in the fractures, that's in the matrix, bedrock matrix itself, it's there, it's moving slowly. It contributes to the system, but most of the action is happening in the conduit. So if you really want to understand, manage, protect, conserve, restore a karst aquifer, you need to understand the conduit system itself. So getting back to our drainage story, once you're down here in the aquifer, friend of mine here swimming, again, I should emphasize swimming, the water is deep here, in this karst aquifer. Imagine you drilled for water and you hit this underground river here. You think you hit the mother lode. You could put in the largest pump in the world and it would be able to keep pulling and pulling water, and you think you've got it made. No problem. You've got a seemingly infinite supply of water. And that's a problem because a lot of times people can overpump karst aquifers. They confuse pumping rate with sustainable use, and they are not the same. Imagine you go to your bathtub. You know, you need a cup of water, but you go to your bathtub with a bucket, and your bathtub's filled with water, and you could pull out a bucket of water. You only need a cup, but you pulled out a bucket, and you pull out another bucket, but pretty soon that bathtub's running low because you're pulling out more water than it is sustainably able to replenish itself with. And even though we've got a lot of water in this spot, in this underground stream, it's only being replenished at a certain rate. It's much like a bank account. You know, it doesn't matter if you have $1 million in savings, if you spend more money than what you use, you're going to run out of money. And so we need to think about sustainable use of our karst systems. And so what happens when the karst system is overpumped? Well, wells go dry, springs go dry. This is a San Antonio spring behind Incarnate Word College. That's the proper name of the spring. Everyone calls it the Blue Hole, but there are thousands of blue holes around the world. It's a very popular name for any karst spring. But the spring does go dry, and here's a photo of it dry. And here's Dr. Mitchell, and here's Mr. Dr. Mitchell. When the water rises, and it rises out of a cave, it flows out through this channel. There's a wall built around this thing, and it flows out and goes downstream toward the Riverwalk. So that's some of the things that can happen. Now, before I discuss my next topic here of spring discharge, I want to focus a little bit more about the San Antonio Spring and something that's a couple of things that are unusual. This is one of the Hydrological springs. It's one of the higher elevation springs. The highest elevation spring occurs out in Uvalde. Here's the spring flow coming out of this. Chances are that this spring flow and the Leona River springs out in Uvalde one time had endemic ecosystems living in that spring flow, much like we see in New Braunfels and at San Marcos, at the Comal Springs and the San Marcos Springs. But the reason we don't see them here is because these are higher up in the aquifer and they went dry. And these ecosystems, and I suspect there would have been endemic species here, would have died out long ago. Now, when this spring goes dry, to add another level of complexity to the aquifer, and another hidden aspect, is over here, back in this valley here is Almas Creek. And when this spring is dry, and Almas Creek floods on past, hits the channel where the spring is, some of the water will flood up this channel and whirlpool down into the Idris Aquifer, draining 75 square kilometers of highly urbanized North San Antonio into the clean portion of the aquifer. So we've got polluted recharge occurring in this location. This is the biggest location. It occurs throughout the Almas Basin, but this is the biggest location where it occurs. And so a source of potential contamination into the aquifer that's hidden and unrecognized by most people. Now, spring discharge. Water is a hidden economic asset for karst aquifers. We talk about all sorts of economic benefits for communities, but most people don't think about water. We talk about, a new business coming to town. How many jobs, how much money will it bring? But we don't ask, do we have enough water to sustainably support this extra population growth? Is this activity in a place that might pollute our water supply? Because if our water supply goes dry, if our water supply is contaminated, then we're gone. San Antonio's gone. What happens? Without water, everything shuts down. So water is the most important economic asset, and yet it's often not valued or undervalued in many, many studies. And in fact, if you look at the distribution of communities in especially dry areas, you find that they are located along springs. Most communities are built along rivers in wetter climates, but San Antonio was built around the San Antonio and the San Pedro Park Springs across from Sac. Uvalde along the Leon River Springs, New Braunfels to Comal Springs, San Marcos to San Marcos Springs. We see similar, activities going down into Mexico. Here in Carlsbad, New Mexico, the city is built along the Carlsbad Springs. So we see this sort of thing happening around the world. Water is an important economic asset. If we look at this spring discharge, it also goes downstream. So here's a drainage area map for the San Marcos Spring and the San Marcos River. So the spring occurs here, the San Marcos River goes down, and it feeds the community of Martindale, Luling, and Gonzales. Now beyond Gonzales, it merges with the flow of the Guadalupe River, which is spring fed, not just from the Comal Springs in New Braunfels, but also other springs further up the Guadalupe River that are Karst Springs. And then this goes on down and feeds Victoria. 80% of the water in the Guadalupe River, the combined Guadalupe Comal River, San Marcos River in Victoria, 80% of that flow is spring discharge, Karst Spring discharge. Victoria would go away if it wasn't for this. And additionally, this water supports the ecosystems throughout the spring system and down to the Gulf Coast. And so we need to think not just about where the karst is, but its benefits and impacts downstream. So let's transition now to ecosystems and focus on types of cave animals. This is my beloved cat, Cueva. For those of you who don't speak Spanish, Cueva means cave. I found Cueva in a cave. She is an accidental. Accidentals are types of animals that normally don't occur in caves. They might go in there for shelter, to get away from the heat, from the cold, from the rain. If they're injured, they may go in there until they heal. Cueva took shelter in a cave on Camp Bullis, and she was nearly dead of starvation because she's not adapted. Accidentals are not adapted to living in caves. If she would have died, it would have been an important source of food energy into the cave ecosystem. I'm glad she didn't. She's over 21 years old, and if you heard a cat meowing in the background, that was her. Now, Trogloscenes. Now we're getting to cave adapted types of animals. This is the lowest level of cave adaptation, and yet the most famous cave animal is a Trogloscene. It has that lowest level of adaptation, and those are bats. This is a bat that died naturally in the cave. It was clinging to a cave wall when it died. Many bats do this. They hang, their feet, when their feet relax, they relax in a gripping position. And so they die and just naturally hang on. And then it decomposed on the cave wall, made a feast for cave microorganisms and insects, and that was eventually covered with calcite. So we've got this fossilized remnant of this. But Trogloscenes are defined as animals that have some level of cave adaptation, but they have to return to the surface to complete some critical aspect of their life cycle. Usually that's reproduction or more commonly feeding. And that's what bats do. They will go up to the surface to feed at night. Our next level of cave adaptation is a troglophile. This is known as the cave salamander, commonly found in Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, that area. And this is a type of animal where it can spend its entire life cycle underground. It's got a moist skin. It needs the moisture environment of the cave environment to survive. But it doesn't have to live its entire cycle underground. It can spend its part of its life cycle on the surface as well. So this is more cave adapted than Trogloscenes. Our most cave adapted species are called Troglobites. These are obligate cave dwellers. They cannot survive on the surface. The most obvious thing you notice about this millipede is it has no pigment. Food in cave systems is really poor. We're talking about primarily decomposing organic material that's been washed in, fallen in, or died there. And so the caloric value is quite low, the nutrient value is quite low. So evolution gets rid of things that aren't needed, like pigment. Pigment protects you from the sun, protects you from UV radiation. You don't need it in the cave. Additionally, you get rid of eyes. You don't need eyes when you live in total darkness. And so these are some of the adaptations. If you're familiar with millipedes at all, you'll notice that these legs are quite long and the antennae are quite long for a millipede. That makes for more efficient navigation and travel, far more energy efficient navigation in a cave. And so these are obligate cave dwellers. They would not survive on the surface. Because of UV, the greater temperature differences that occur on the surface and so forth. Now, related to troglobites, we have Stigabites, which are troglobites but live underwater. So these are amphipods found in the North Bexar County cave. Fully cave adapted, again, depigmented, eyeless, extended appendages, but these live in the aquifer. And so they're Stigabites. Now, let's talk about some benefits from cave animals. A lot of people don't think that ecosystems are important unless they can see some benefits. Well, if we think about bats alone, bats produce over 450 different foods, industrial products, and medicines, either directly or indirectly. A lot of bats are pollinators. They're great seed dispersers. They're incredible at tropical reforestation. So they provide many, many benefits. In the US, most of the bats in the US, not all, but most of them, including these bats here, Mexican three-tails, are insectivorous. So they're flying at night to go hunt for food. And so they provide the benefit of pest control. So this is Doppler radar of the San Antonio area. Here's Bexar County outlined here. And this cloud here, none of what you're looking at is rain. This big cloud here is the bat flight from Bracken Cave. This big cloud here is just ground scatter. You can ignore that. But this is Bracken Cave, the cave you just saw the bat flight from a moment ago, the world's largest known bat colony. Frio bat flight here. The bats from Nye Cave haven't started flying. That's probably McCarty Cave here. The Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin, they haven't started flying yet. That's probably Beck Bat Cave. I believe this is Miller Cave up here. So we're looking at a lot. It's probably Government Canyon Bat Cave over here. Anyway, so we can actually see bats on Doppler radar as a fairly nightly phenomenon on San Antonio radar. And the benefits in terms of pest control, I'll give you the national numbers. In the United States, there was a study published in Science a few years ago that on average, American agriculture saves $23 billion a year in pesticides that do not need to be applied to crops. That's not counting the health benefits of not having those chemicals in our environment. 23 billion a year, thanks to bats, and that's just in the US. So one thing that people usually don't think about is diverse research that's available from bats. One of my former students who graduated from UT Austin, Jean Kretche. She did her dissertation on the Surlanded isopod. It's a stigabite that lives in the aquifers of the Texas Karst, out from beyond Fort Stockton, out near Balmoral State Park, if you're familiar with that, all the way out to the Bacones Fault Zone. Here's Bexar County, there's Austin up here. And so she looked at selected localities and used the DNA of this species to identify different flow paths, modern and past, in the aquifers of Texas, and how they connected in the past, and how they connect now that current hydrologic data doesn't otherwise show us. So you've got a lot of research here. Multidisciplinary research is quite valuable when it comes to karst. And one of the things that's really going on, that's exciting research, is microbial research. NASA is looking for ET, and they realize that up there on Mars, surface conditions are brutal. If they're going to find life, it's almost certainly going to be in a sheltered, moist environment, which is pretty much means a cave. We know of about 1,400 cave entrances on Mars. We've seen them, by the high-rise orbiting, the high-rise orbiting observer. And so these are microbes that we've seen on Earth. This type is just generically called beads on a string for obvious reason. And so NASA is investing a lot of money into studying terrestrial caves to help study caves on other planets and look for life elsewhere. So threats to cave ecosystem, the number one threat to any ecosystem is loss of habitat. When it comes to caves and karst, we're looking at filling and covering of caves by homes, roads, parking lots, other buildings, shopping centers, what have you. But also we're looking at pollution that gets into the karst aquifers, into these ecosystems, and invasive species. Fire ants tend to be highly invasive, and they come into much of central Texas with urbanization. Other species like roaches are also invasive species that outcompete, and fire ants especially predate actually upon cave ecosystem species. So those are some of the threats that occur in cave ecosystems. So to wrap up, just one slide to talk about general solutions. Any one of these slides that I've taken, I can transform into a day-long or a week-long lecture. There's just so much detail to still go into. So I'm just going to talk about some conceptual solutions that I use as guideposts to managing karst problems. The first thing that I want to mention is the word environment. A phrase I really hate is that when people talk about the environment, if I say the house burned down, you'd say, well, that's too bad for those folks. If I said our house burned down, now you'd be concerned. It's our house. It's not the environment. It's not separate from us. It's our environment. It affects us. And words have power. If we start talking about our environment, that will start to resonate with more people. Think about that for this coming Earth Day in 2 days. It's our environment. We depend on it. So yes, there are karst environmental problems. There are environmental problems. So for research itself, use cave maps and karst data in your research. But of course, use data and analyze data from other sources too, both traditional hydrogeologic sources, but multidisciplinary sources. I've found great value to biological data. I've used archaeological, paleontological data to tell me a great deal about these karst systems, even though I'm a hydrogeologist. And it's important to involve cave and karst scientists. I've seen a lot of excellent scientists botch the job because they weren't specialized in karst. If I have a heart problem, I don't go see a podiatrist. I go see a cardiologist, I see a heart specialist. And likewise, if I have a foot problem, I see a podiatrist, not a cardiologist. Cave and karst is a highly specialized scientist. Involve cave and karst scientists in your work. General rules of thumb for management is to avoid or minimize urbanization and development of karst areas. in San Antonio, I've long advocated that we should not be building north. We have a choice in San Antonio. We've been building north onto the karst, onto the Aquifer recharge zone, when we could build east, west, or south. Beautiful areas, but we don't. Here in this photo down below, Guilin, China. Guilin can't afford karst. I mean, it's in this tower karst area. There's karst surrounding it, above it, and below it. So if you're going to be in a karst area, prohibit or minimize high volume and high toxicity contaminants when you're on karst. Minimize these things to cause you less problems. As part of the theme of the International Year of Caves and Karst, involve and educate land managers and the public. The public in San Antonio is one of the best educated about karst. At the National Cave and Karst Research Institute, when we hired our education director, I sent her around the country to see what's going on in other areas. And she came back and said that there were only 2 areas of the country where people understood the word aquifer and karst, at least in general. They may not have known the technical definitions, but at least they had a general sense of them. And that was the San Antonio, Austin area, and it was in Florida. And because we have a well-educated public, we have issues, where we've gone out and bought lands to protect our recharge zone. We've spent, what is it, over $200 million now to buy and protect lands. So public education is important. And then of course, take extra steps to protect karst. There's a major textbook on karst, and it has a subchapter that says karst, expect the unexpected. They're not being doom and gloom, they're being practical. Because of the complexity of these systems, many unexpected things do happen. And so just be prepared, take the extra steps to protect yourselves. So in closing, if you want to learn more, and I hope you do, you're welcome to follow us at NCRI, the National Cave and Karst Research Institute. Again, our website's here. I will tell you that our website is being rebuilt. The information here is old, and there's not nearly as much as we'd like. And within about 2 months, we should have a fabulous website up. I've been proofing it, working with the website designers, and exciting. It's really exciting to see what's coming up. So bookmark it for the future. The International Union of Speleology. If you're interested in caves from a scientific or educational or a recreational point of view, this will connect you with organizations around the world of how you can get involved. And there is a caving organization in San Antonio, the Bear Grotto. They meet the 2nd and 4th Mondays of each month, virtually now, of course, but they're part of the members of the International Union. The Karst Information Portal. This is a virtual online library that NCRI and the International Union and other partners have put together that's free. It has materials from around the world on anything and everything involving karst. So if you're looking for something, go there, search for a keyword, and you'll find all sorts of information to help you in your work on karst. And of course, it's the International Year. The theme of the International Year is explore, understand, protect, which takes us back to how I started this presentation. I didn't focus on restoration because most people don't understand karst. And so unless you understand something, you first need to explore it to get that understanding, and then you protect it. The International Year website has a lot of great information about caves and karst around the world, how it works, some of its challenges. You're welcome to join us as an International Year event in addition to this one, which will be added to the International Year website. If you go to the events section of the website, go to event results, you'll find a whole lot of lectures from around the world on many topics of karst that you'll just find fascinating, incredibly informative. And of course, there's my email address. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. If you want to be on NCRI's email list for Caves and Karst News, we send messages 2 or 3 times a month. Again, feel free to email me. So I'll just leave it here so you can copy down this information if you want it. And I'd be glad to answer questions. So.
Thank you so much, George, for such an informative presentation. We would like to encourage the participants to continue to ask your questions. You can use either the Q&A box or the chat box. The chat box will also go to the panelists, and Diane and I will go ahead and ask those to George so that he can answer them. I'm going to start because we had Elizabeth Montgomery, who's one of the instructors at PAC, who teaches the geology classes. She had a comment and a couple questions. The first one was that she wanted you to know that when she was a graduate student working on stable isotopes of lacustrine deposits, running stable isotopes there, that there was someone else in the lab that was working on speleothems. So she said, yes, that's very important work, and she was excited to hear you talk about that. Another question she had was when you talked about your faculty member at UTSA who told you there's not much water in the caves, she wondered, was that Dr. Hammond by chance?
No comment. I will protect the innocent. Although if you look at how old I am and you know the faculty history from back then, you can figure out who taught hydrogeology back then and figure it out. But no, no comment.
I was trying to remember because Dr. Hammond was still there when I did my PhD, and then there was somebody else who was before him also, and I'm just couldn't. I'm blanking on names right now, but.
And the thing is, regardless of who it is, you know, in this sense, it doesn't matter, because these are perceptions that people have around the world. It's one of the issues I've been saying, that there are many great geologists, hydrogeologists, biologists working in karst, but because they're not specially trained in karst, they miss the boat. They miss some key aspects, and sometimes they get things wrong. When I was working as a consultant, I was often called in essentially to undo some of the mistakes made by the consultants. You know, not that they were stupid or evil or anything. Good people. It's just not trained in karst. So, yeah.
So I had another question here. Did you find many in situ archaeological finds, are most of them swept into the cave?
It's not unusual to find material washed into a cave, but there's really not much archaeological value to it because there's no context. You know, it's a point or a bone or something that was washed in. But caves that are hydrologically inactive tend to be some of the most important archaeological and paleontological sites in the world. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a report out of Israel where they found a basket in a cave 10,000 years old and so well preserved that they could tell that the person who made it was left-handed. Mm-hmm. So in some cultures, they would use caves deliberately in ritual ways, in practical ways, and sometimes it would change over time. So it really depends on what time period and which culture. But a lot of material has been deliberately placed in caves. In some cultures, it's limited to the entrance zone. There are some cultures that actually went very far back in the caves. For example, in the Mammoth Cave area, they went thousands of meters back in the caves to mine minerals. Whereas if you go to Maya Mesoamerica, Guatemala, Yucatan, you know, down in that area, Belize, you've got people who went into the cave for ritual purposes. So it depends on the area.
Okay, we have a question from the chat. How does the compressibility of the karst skeleton compare to a non-karst limestone aquifer?
By karst skeleton, I'm assuming you mean the basic framework of the karst aquifer, the conduit passages themselves. It's really a non-issue. You know, we're talking about bedrock that is functionally non-compressible, not at a scale that's meaningful in terms of karst groundwater management. The more water you put into it, in some cases, you might be able to lubricate the system and wash away some sediments, but the bedrock itself doesn't change, at least not within the human lifespan. The groundwater will dissolve the rock, based on my dissertation research on the Glenrose limestone just north of town, the lower member of the Glenrose. The limestone in this region is dissolving at an average rate of about 2.5 centimeters, about an inch per 1,000 years. Now, we've seen in some areas where you put a dam and then you grout below the dam to keep water from leaking below the dam, that water will then try to focus and flow more rapidly through certain channels. And with enough pressure, you might physically and chemically erode some conduits a little bit faster. But the only places you really see that make a significant difference is in your evaporate aquifers, your gypsum or your halite systems. When you see enlargement in karst, it's usually not the bedrock. It's just more that the sediment is being washed away in those situations.
I'm guessing that question may have also been comparing aquifers that are not karst aquifers to karst aquifers. Like in Houston, we have aquifers, we have groundwater there, and we see subsidence issues there because of the fact that when the water is removed, the material packs together more tightly. But that's not typically an issue with karst aquifers because of the fact that the cement of the material, although it dissolves, the overall skeleton isn't compressed as that happens.
Excellent point. Like I said, I really did get into sinkholes. I'll just briefly say, when it comes to sinkhole collapse, most people assume when they see a sinkhole form that the rock fell into a cave. And that does occur in some places. You do have bedrock collapse, but most collapses occur in soil. The big collapses you see, for example, in Florida, are soil collapses where the soil washes down into a cave, creates a cave in the soil, and then the soil roof collapses down. But subsidence in like the Houston area, that's a very different situation there. So a much different situation. Karst itself, the limestone itself, doesn't compress and collapse in that manner.
I want to mention there are a couple links that have been shared in the chat. Sabra Booth, who's one of our organizers with EcoExchangeEdu, has shared a link to some portraits of Cascade Cavern salamanders that she has made. And I've also placed a link to upcoming EcoExchangeEdu events later today as well as tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a great point. The Cascades Cavern salamander, it's recently been, I believe it's been lumped in with what's called the Honey Creek blind salamander, Eurecia tridentifera. The genetics are still being argued about by the specialists, but essentially the longest cave in Texas, Honey Creek Cave, we knew that cave crossed from the Guadalupe drainage basin, where the entrance is, to the Cibolo drainage basin, because it had these salamanders that are only known from the Cibolo drainage basin. And so there's the biology informing us something about the hydrogeology. And finally, exploration ended up demonstrating that for us.
So we've had a couple questions I see in the chat and in the Q&A about where we can find the recording. What we are going to do, we are recording this session and we will be sharing it with Dr. Veni so it can be shared through the International Year of Karst portal, as well as St. Mary's will also have a recording, a link that we can send out to the EcoExchange group, and then that can be shared on the EEE page as well.
And you're getting a lot of kudos, Dr. Veni, for your presentation. Dr. Kevin Salfin, who's one of our organizers with EcoExchangeEdu, thanks you for this presentation and says clearly policy change is the only way to address problems of this scale. It also is slow moving and unfortunately unlikely. Have you seen local policy changes or instances of corporate activism that have made a difference?
Oh, well, thanks for the kudos from everyone. I've heard a lot of frustration from younger people, and I get it. I've been doing this for 46 years, When I first started as a geology student, and even before then as just a lowly cave explorer, although I still hold cave explorer as my favorite title. But what I was told by the university professors in San Antonio, in Austin, by the Edwards Underground Water District, which has now been replaced by the Aquifer Authority, by the various state water agencies, by federal agencies, the U.S. Geological Survey, what they all told me was there's no karst in Texas. Yeah, there's caves and there's some sinkholes. If you want to find karst, you have to go to Mammoth Cave. You have to go to Kentucky. You'll find karst there. Now everyone acknowledges that we have karst. Prior to COVID, the Aquifer Authority was having a biannual karst lecture series that they would have. It was hosted by Southwest Research Institute. So everyone is understanding that yes, we do have karst. That's the first initial step. So we're seeing some changes. Corporate changes, we've seen some corporate support. When Government Canyon State Natural Area was the product of the Government Canyon Coalition, there were 45 civic, environmental, business, and governmental organizations that got together to protect that area. And so this was, at least within the San Antonio region, this was the first time that we had business and government and environmental, all these groups come together for a common goal. But leading up to that was still a process because, you know, for those of you who remember, there was a savings and loan crisis at the time. A lot of banks went belly up. A lot of the recharge zone was available for a song. We could have bought and protected much of the recharge zone back then. And when the coalition first went out to try to make that happen, Texas Parks and Wildlife said, well, we're not in the land management business. Well, we are in the land management business, but for special lands, but we don't have the money to really buy land. We went to San Antonio Water System. They said they're not in the land management business. We went to the Aquifer Authority. They said the same. We went to the city of San Antonio, and the city at this time says, are you crazy? I mean, who buys land to protect their water supply? And I said, have you heard of this town called New York City? They essentially own the Catskill Mountains to protect their water supply. Eventually, everyone came together. And through that, we led into what was at the time the first proposition known as Prop 3, that, you know, where the citizens voted to approve $45 million to buy land to protect their water supply. And so it's been growing, but politically there is a lot of inertia. It's a much harder process. The boundaries of the Aquifer recharge zone need to change. We know that parts of the Glen Rose Formation and other formations recharge the Edwards, but trying to get that through the legislature is going to be a bloodbath. You know, I mean, it's going to be really difficult. Hopefully I'm exaggerating. Hopefully it won't be. But in general, we're making progress. It's slow, but I've seen the progress over the years. I would love to see it happen quicker. But progress is happening.
Well, I think that really is a great point for the end of our lecture here today, is that's why the International Year of Cave and Karst is so important in educating everybody, because the more people that understand about what's happening underneath their feet, the more likely we are as a group to ask our legislators to protect our water supply and to make that a priority in our cities. There was another comment I just wanted to share as a final thought. One of the attendees said, thank you for mentioning the importance of word choice about our planet. Everything we do matters. Local actions are so important. So that's part of why we have the EcoExchangeEdu group, is that we are trying to educate and get people within the San Antonio region to look at environmental issues and sustainability, and to use the ideas of the things that we learn about that in order to make our society better. So at this point, I would like to thank Dr. George Veni for joining us today and for giving such a wonderful lecture, and for everyone who participated. And hopefully we will see you at more of our events for throughout the next couple of days.
Thank you very much. I'll point out the International Year, because of COVID, has been extended to 2022. So
Yes.
we're considering this our virtual year, and next year will hopefully be our in-person year. So and again, this idea of our environment, of word choice, that might help make some people think twice on the political spectrum, might help those folks more amenable to realize that it's our environment. They are affected by the decisions and policies that they make. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.